I think that the art of the anthology horror movie has almost been lost. You don't really get movies like Creepshow, Body Bags, Two Evil Eyes, or Quicksilver Highway anymore, and when you do, it tends to be direct-to-DVD fare, not theatrical releases from big studios. So when I heard about this movie coming out, being vaguely aware of the scary stories to tell in the dark books, I thought this could be it. The film that brings back the anthology horror film. I mean, it's a book of short stories. What could they possibly do? Set it in the 60s in some attempt to associate themselves with the recent Stephen King's It adaptations and slap ham-fisted social commentary down our throats through some predictable story about a book of tales that come true? You already know that's exactly what they did. Guillermo del Toro said at San Diego Comic-Con in 2019, and I quote, "When we started talking about this 5 years ago, I had to think about it. Anthology films are always as bad as the worst story in them. They're never as good as the best story. I remembered in Pan's Labyrinth I created a book called The Book of Crossroads. I thought it would be great if we had a book that reads you, and it writes what you're most afraid of. Then the theme became stories we tell each other." So first of all, there was absolutely no reason to set this story in the 60s. None whatsoever. I know Guillermo has a tendency to make horror films with a historical war backdrop, a la The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth. But those movies were orchestrated by Del Toro, for one thing, specifically to cater to those time periods. Here it feels like the filmmakers are trying to ride on the coattails of the recent It adaptations by shoehorning in the period setting, which I'm sure the writers were fine with because fuck me did they have it out for Richard Nixon. Seriously, if you come away from the film thinking Nixon was the villain, that's probably because he was. Forget spiders bursting out of a girl's face or weird smiling fat demons in hospital hallways. The ghost of Tricky Dick is living rent-free in the minds of the screenwriters. From Nixon campaign posters defaced with swastikas, yes, comparing each other's candidates to Nazis is not a recent development by any stretch, to the periodic intervals in the film where we're treated to black and white broadcasts of the presidential campaign Nixon eventually won, it's clear that this film feels like it needs to remind you that yes, we are indeed in 1968, and that war is bad, and Nixon was worse. It's kind of reminiscent of Atomic Blonde in that sense. The filmmakers don't have the talent to immerse you in the year of 68, so they have to slam it in your face once every so often. Oh look, here's some footage of Nixon talking about not wanting to bomb anyone unless it's absolutely necessary, with an afro-sporting black woman sassily opining, "Tricky Dick, that ain't no name for a president." And here's a radio presenter with his hourly reminder that war is bad and shit, just in case you forgot. It has little, if anything, to do with the plot, but we're desperate for critics to finish on our faces with a shower of good reviews, and we don't know how to do it any other way. Actually, that's not totally true. It does kind of have something to do with the plot, but we'll get to that later. So the story starts off with Stella Nichols, a miserable nerd whose mother left her and her dad because she's a miserable nerd, which only makes her more of a miserable nerd, and the situation doesn't really change at all throughout the film. She goes out trick-or-treating with her two possibly friend-zoned guy friends, Augie and Chuck, despite the fact that all of them are in high school and should not be knocking on strangers' doors in costumes asking for candy. No, that kind of potentially dangerous activity is relegated solely to elementary school-aged kids, thank you very much. So Augie is basically Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, but more tolerable, and Chuck is a raging retard who we first see fishing turds out of the toilet with the bathroom door wide open. This essentially being a Stephen King ripoff, naturally there are one-dimensional psychopathic jocks armed with baseball bats roaming the streets, and Chuck thinks it would be appropriate to tempt fate for both himself and his friends by setting a bag of the aforementioned turds on fire and chucking it into the jock's car while he's driving. No doubt shocked by the jock's reactions to almost being burned alive in their own vehicle, the group escapes to a nearby drive-in cinema where they meet the most sensitively named Latino character since Chico Gonzalez from Dirty Harry, Ramon Rodriguez, as he sits quietly watching Night of the Living Dead, making everyone in the audience wish they were watching Night of the Living Dead. It's at this point that I start placing bets as to how long it will be before Ramon Sombrero Santino Burrito is racially abused. It didn't take long. After all, anyone in a movie nowadays who isn't white in an R-rated movie has to at some point be racially abused because writers nowadays can't think of any other way to make an audience sympathise with a brown person. As I ponder as to how Ramon managed to get his car over the border fence, the jocks are shooed off and Stella suddenly decides that she's got a craving for dark and swarthy meat, and so out of nowhere suggests that he join them on an exposition to a haunted house that no one has mentioned up until this point. Upon them entering the house, they find a book of horror stories written by a girl who was held captive in a secret room because her family were a bunch of rich fucks. One by one, Stella's friends are made victims of the book as it writes stories about each of them based on their worst fears. This film is bargain basement it. It has the elements: period small town setting, group of friends, things that imitate your worst fears, psycho jocks slash greasers, shit parents, racism, etc, etc. Problem is the characters are slasher movie tier, the visuals are the same blue tinted almost day for night shit that we're accustomed to nowadays, predictable jump scares abound, and it's all framed with some of the worst social commentary I've seen in a recent movie. It didn't even have to be bad. Ramon, you see, turns out to be a draft dodger, and so when the book cottons onto this, it sends a fucked up looking creature that builds itself out of various body parts, no doubt in reference to Ramon's brother being sent back home from the war in pieces. Naturally, when the cops catch him, they brand him a coward and shove him in lockup. The idea actually isn't bad, and the jangly man creature from the story Me Tai Doti Walker is one of the best parts of the film, putting aside the unscary CGI and the fact that at times it looks like what it would be like if Willem Dafoe melted. Again though, the filmmakers don't have the talent to execute the idea with any kind of subtlety. Maybe it would have been better if the police officer sympathised with Ramon, perhaps showing him a scar from when he himself was drafted to fight in Vietnam, thereby getting a more in-depth look into the lives of the people in the town and how this war on the other side of the world has impacted them. But no, policeman bad, so he kicks the Mexican into a jail cell yelling, "You're gonna do your duty to America, boy!" as cannons blast, eagles cry, and Star Spangled Banner blares out in the distance. The positives? Like I said, putting aside the CGI, some of the creatures are pretty cool, some of the photography is interesting, and there's at least one scene in a hospital that does manage to almost hit the mark in terms of horror, and it's the scene that almost completely eschews any jump scares. The negatives? Everything else. Aside from some interesting camera moments, it's dreary to look at and becomes a chore to watch. It's largely humourless, and whatever humour does come across tends to be groan-inducing Whedonisms that not only fall flat but feel anachronistic for the period it's set in. The characters are largely two-dimensional, and so it's hard to really care about any of them. Del Toro was wrong. They should have just taken some of the more popular stories from the books, fleshed them out a bit, and then released it as an anthology movie. Set them all in the same town by all means, even have the stories linked with common characters and settings. Trick or Treat did it back in 2007, I remember that movie actually being pretty great, as Naked Female Werewolf Orgy attests. Top it all off with shit-tier social commentary and a confusing ending that seems to gun for a sequel, and you have yet another crappy modern horror to throw on the ever-growing pile. Despite this, it hasn't made me lose interest in reading the old books, so I'll be picking them up soon to see what they were like when they were hopefully good. It would honestly have been better if they had made a movie about a small town where people are murdered one by one in gruesome fashions, and it turned out the killer was literally Richard Nixon with a sack over his head. At least that would have been funny. I'd call it The Town That Dreaded Dick. I'm DeadEye, and I hope you all rot in hell.